Hello, good people. As you can see, I'm bringing the boy band back together. Um, so let's talk about chapter 11. So let's talk about affect, attitudes, and behaviors at work. So let's look at our learning objectives for the chapter. All right, so what we got going on here? So we're going to talk about affect, moods, and emotions. And so this is kind of more the psychological variables associated with work. And then we're going to get into some of those constructs, these IO psychology constructs that are kind of unique to IO psychology. We're going to talk about things like job satisfaction, work commitment, employee engagement, organizational justice. And we're going to talk about some of the behaviors that we labeled that typically happen in the workplace. So we're talking about citizenship behavior, counterproductive behaviors, and other kind of conceptual behaviors. Talk a little bit about organizational politics and how that's sort of awful. And we'll end talking about the psychological contract, which is kind of an interesting concept that you probably are somewhat already familiar with. All right, so let's talk about affect, moods, and emotions and what the differences are between those. Um, so affect is a broad term. And so I don't know if you um, in any of your other psychology classes you've ever taken that kind of stuff. I typically always remember the ABCs, affect, behavior, and cognition. That's kind of what psychology is always kind of um, involved with. Like they're always talking about either your affect, sort of your emotional experiences, your behaviors, which we'll talk a little bit about later on, like I mentioned, and then we got the cognitions is how you think. So, affect, moods, and emotions are going to be a little bit more of the emotional part of stuff. So, affect is a broad term that all range of feelings described along a positive and negative continuum. So, typically, affect has to have some sort of positive or negative reaction. It can't just be nothing. It has to be something. It has to be either positive or negative, and typically we can label those things on a continuum. Um, when we say the word moods, it's probably not maybe what you're familiar with, but moods is sort of a general disposition. It's almost like I don't want to call it a personality characteristic, but it's almost like a relatively long-lasting emotional state that people tend to be in. And so it's typically a little bit longer lasting than say an emotion. And so that's what discriminate when we're talking about emotions is that typically emotions tend to be shorter, discrete, and they're typically about something. They came from something, they originated from something. And so that's what we mean when we say target specific. So something, you had a bad coworker interaction or you just found out a bad policy at work and that kind of stuff, then that can lead to a quick emotion about something, and that typically doesn't last, but it definitely has sort of an origin, a target kind of specific thing, and so it could be your colleagues, your boss, a general new bit of information, that kind of stuff. Whereas moods are a little bit more longer lasting, and so what I mean by that is it's kind of like you just know some people are just tend to be a little bit more sullen or happy all the time and that kind of stuff. We don't tend to do too much research on moods. We do tend to do a lot more research on emotions, and then we try to sort of understand moods by labeling concepts that are more affective. So let's keep talking about this stuff. So let's emotions, like I just said, they typically have just like an affect. They have a negative or a positive sort of connotation, but um, there's been a history of the evolution of understanding emotions in the workplace, and so you might start with the idea that something is bad, it's a negative emotion, is actually bad for the workplace, and so we've done some more research to try to find out if that's truly the case, and it's actually not. And so there are certain circumstances where a negative emotion might actually be beneficial when it comes to productivity and performance and probably really just growth in general. Um, Here's some examples I was talking about in your textbook. So, like guilt and shame, we would consider those negative emotions. Nobody wants to be in a constant state of guilt or a constant state of shame, but that does deter unethical behavior at work. So, if you feel guilty about stealing paper clips or something like that, then it's going to make you less likely to do that kind of stuff, which in general is good for the organization. sometimes in people, sadness inspires tax perseverance. And so if you're sad about something, that might motivate you to do something else. If you're happy, then you're like, I want to stay happy. But if I'm sad, I want to get out of this sadness. And maybe that sadness is getting that work analysis done. And you're like, okay, if I get this done, then I don't feel any sadness. But that doesn't necessarily work with all people. What a lot of research has been done on is anger. And I don't know if you have a personal sort of understanding associated with this, but I know I personally do. Part of the reason why I kept on going into grad school and why I wanted to get a doctorate and all that kind of stuff because I was kind of angry. Like I was angry at people who were calling the shots in organizations that I didn't think knew any better. So I was like, well, then I'm going to go learn and I'm going to know better, and then I'm going to put myself in the position to be able to make change. And so that anger actual like sort of motivated me and that kind of stuff. But there's a balance there, and so let's just look at the dual threshold model of workplace anger here on the next slide, and we'll talk a little bit more about that here. So this is a little bit more along the lines of when anger can be bad, really, in either direction. So let's take a look at this picture. So you have your feeling of anger. So you've got the emotion of anger. If you can't express it, so imagine you're at a workplace and you got angry at your boss and you can't chew them out, or you're working customer service and you want to punch somebody in the face. You can't do that, and that kind of stuff. So you have to suppress that anger. Typically, suppressing any sort of negative emotion is probably not going to be the most psychologically healthy thing for the rest of your life. So if you're unable to express it, then that's a problem. So if you have a highly stressful job that could lead to anger, that job really should have a way to release that anger in a healthier sort of situation and that sort of thing. So there should be things designed within the organization by the organization for that kind of job. But there are some jobs that, you're like, no, like you can express it. You can go talk to your boss. You can go talk to your coworker. You can go talk to a supervisor or something like that. And then if you're able to talk, then that probably will end up translating into improving the situation because whatever made you angry was probably not good either for you or for someone else or both. And so if you're able to express that anger, then that could be motivating to make change. And so you don't want to just sit there and say, stay silent. You have to suppress it. Then that's going to build and grow and be ugly and that kind of stuff. But you're able to express it, that actually might lead to change and improvement and that sort of thing. But then if you express it and it keeps growing and that it doesn't end up getting higher, or if you express it and it's good, like you're able to do it, you're able to make change and that kind of stuff. But what happens if you express it, you weren't able to make change, it stays there, and then you just feel like you can express it a little bit more? Well, if you over express it, we would consider that as deviant anger, and then that would translate into more higher negative outcomes. And so we'll talk about some of those examples here following the next couple of slides here. But I mean, that's when you're talking about like, punching people, punching walls, breaking things, destroying things, stealing things to try to minimize that anger, that over amount of anger and that kind of stuff. So anger isn't just as simple as saying, "Oh, it's bad," because it's not necessarily bad. It's under this the research has demonstrated that this model is kind of how anger can sort of work within the workplace because we don't want to sit here and live in a non-realistic world where saying, "Oh, at work you'll never become angry," because that's not true. So you're going to be angry. It's just can you design the system to be in this middle ground where you can express your anger and that can lead to improvements and minimize any sort of suppression or explosion, really, of deviant anger. So on the opposite side of anger, sort of, although you could be angry and happy at the same time, there's some people like that. Um, some of the research that's been done in the workplace is this idea of happiness, and so it's kind of assumed that if you're happy, then good things happen. And so we did the research in the IO world, and this is true. So you've got a lot of good outcomes if you're happy. So what do we got going on here? We got um, happiness. Employee happiness has been related to organizational commitment, higher performance, stronger citizenship performance, lower turnover, fewer counterproductive workplace behaviors, so a whole bunch of different stuff. And so, of course, you'd be like, all right, great. Like, how can we make our workforce happy? Happy people tend to have all these happier outcomes. Let's do something about it. Well, if you keep going into the literature and you dig a little deeper in the psychological underpinnings of happiness, you realize that current estimates in the scientific realm put your determinants of happiness to be about 50% genetically determined. So, unless you're going to start doing genetic testing to select the happy people for your workplace, which again, you might be able to in the future, and so that can get real trippy. But if but if you're not doing that, then you can't control the genetics of your work team at that point. So now if you want to have an impact on happiness of your employees, let's say you're a manager and you want to make the place happier, well, if you're dealing with a genetically predisposed group of people who are going to be unhappy, you're not going to have that much of an effect. And then we've got this orange part of this personal outlook. And the personal outlook, you might be able to change slightly for an individual, but man, that's really heavily determined by that individual person's choice of ways of thought. And so you might be able to try to manipulate that, but again, that's difficult to do. And then you got life circumstances, which you control their work life circumstances, but you don't control their life circumstances. You don't control their family circumstances, their friend circumstances, their political circumstances, any of that kind of stuff. So you can't control that either. So we're left in a bind here. You would love to make your workforce happy, but how are you going to do that when so much of it's out of your control? So that's what this picture is kind of trying to tell us there. Um, a couple other concepts that we use in IO psychology that you should understand the definition for is emotional labor. I think we talked about this a little bit before. Um, and so certain jobs have higher levels of emotional labor. You know what? Well, I'm going to keep talking about emotional labor. So, I want to explain the difference between surface and deep acting. So, surface acting is, you don't actually believe that. So, say you have to put on a happy face because the customer's in front of you, and you're having a bad day, and they're having a bad day, and they're sharing their bad day with you, but you kind of can't punch them in the face, or be ugly toward them, or rude, or any of that kind of stuff. So you pretend to not be rude, but it's not deep. It's not like you're changing your emotion reaction to this person. It's just you have to appear to be happy when you know you're not happy. And that's kind of surface. So you're only changing your surface emotion. And some jobs have higher surface labor needs versus deep acting. Deep acting is when you actually change that emotion. So you change yourself. So if you have to be happy and that kind of stuff, can you actually physically get yourself to be happy so that you're no longer surface acting, you're actually acting normally because you changed your deep level of emotions. And what's curious about some of the research has demonstrated that surface acting is actually more laborious and has more negative outcomes. So if you have to like constantly act and put on a happy face when you're not, it's actually worse for you than actually trying to deeply change your emotions so that you're not acting anymore, but you have to change an emotion. So it's kind of interesting that changing that deep level of emotion is actually better. I wouldn't say I mean, what's found is that it might be even less laborious than surface acting continually, because if you're constantly surface acting, you're spending so much emotional labor to try to appear to be something that you're not. And so we found a lot of negative outcomes associated with that.